We're going to start with Mr. Baraka.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
This is a thing called We Must Denounce Carlos Moore and His Character Assassination of the Cuban Revolution. I met Carlos Moore in the 60s, just after the Cuban Revolution. He claims today that at one time he was a Marxist, but when I met him, he had just published a book called Were Marx and Engels White Races? He had changed the word proletarian to prolet-Aryan. Moore, as I first learned and have continued to be amazed by, is a very far right-wing so-called black nationalist who is somewhere on the dial near Roy Innis. If you know Roy Innis, you know Carlos Moore. The main thing about Moore is that he hates socialism and communism. That's the main thing. You know, he hates socialism and he hates communism and views these like some of my dim-witted or unreconstructed right-wing nationalist associates of the past as, quote, a white ideology. The fact that some of the greatest Pan-African patriots, Du Bois, Robeson, C.L.R. James, Nkrumah, Cabral, Rodney, we know have been Marxists, makes no difference to Moore. And any study of his output of writing and lectures since the 60s would show him inexorably bound to be pushed to the wall of absurdity. You have only to read responsible critics of his work through the years to understand this. One, for instance, read Pierre Perez Sarduy in his open letter to Carlos Moore in 1990. He remarks how Moore's appearances at the New School and the Schomburg were set up by a person named Heriberto Dixon, who had speakers openly requesting support for extreme right-wing exiled Cuban terrorist groups, as he said, to bring the beginning of the end to the Castro dictatorships. The group, Sarduy says, quote, who want to see Cuba return to being the little Alabama it was before 1959. Moore lived for a long time in the U.S. and returned to Cuba after the revolution and worked for a time as a translator at a news agency. But according to Sarduy, he disappeared only a few years later to write an article in Présence Africaine, Is There a Place for Black People in the Cuban Revolution? Not only did Sarduy answer this attack, but also the great Haitian Marxist poet René de Pestre, who also answered it, who was living in Cuba at the time in 1965, with his letter from Cuba, also in Présence Africaine. And they attacked Moore's, quote, multiple outdated warped theories that were both contradictory and decontextualized, quote. Moore's insulting statements that Comandante Juan Almeida, a black Cuban major in the Cuban Revolutionary Army, one of the original Barbudos, whom I met when I went to Cuba in 1960, was a hero and a hero of the revolution. They said he was in the Cuban army because he was duped. He was duped. Is this the same mindless reactionary trash that backward nationalists always use to insult black communists? Somewhere we're not smart enough to be nationalists, we're communists. And this is really a wild thing he said. He said, a nationalist white bourgeoisie imposed Marxist ideology on black revolutionaries. You mean a nationalist white bourgeoisie imposed Marxism? Why? So they could overthrow the bourgeoisie? It don't make that much sense, you know? Elsewhere, Moore has said that Fidel's friendship with Stokely Carmichael and Robert Williams was only done so they could get black people to overthrow the U.S. government. Actually, I don't think we needed Fidel to put us up to it. We were trying to do it anyway. And I was with the great Robert Williams in Havana in 1960. And everywhere he went, he was cheered by the Cuban people in the streets after coming to Cuba in exile, driven out of the United States by Ku Klux Klansmen who were really North Carolina State Police. Moore, in one of his most traitorous diatribes against Cuba, lies that Cuba's historic heroism under Fidel Castro's leadership of answering Africa's call, as the brother mentioned, and answering Africa's call to drive the South African government out of Angola and even out of apartheid in South Africa. He says, Moore says this was just opportunism to make white Cubans masters of South Africa. That's so surrealistically despicable, but it characterizes the CIA-like mentality of Moore's continuous attacks. In our petition, we stand with Cuba, who Brother Sam Anderson there is one of the one of the framers of. This was created to fight back against the circulation of this infamous document signed by many unsuspecting black Americans, charging racism was the official policy of the Cuban Socialist State, which is a vicious lie of the US CIA type. And we must address each of these gullible black people. I would suggest in some kind of official way and bring them up to speed on what is going down in the world. They have been viciously and intentionally misinformed. It should be obvious to anyone with their eyes and ears open that this racist charge is only being made now. It's only being made now when there's a chance that the Obama administration might end the oppressive and illegal blockade. That's what this attack on Cuba is. And this dude that just died with this, what was it? What was he on? Hunger strike. The only reason those things are being publicized so they can stop this blockade being lifted. And you should be hip to that. You know what I mean? And certainly Barack Obama should notice the book that Chavez gave him in Trinidad by Eduardo Galeano. The open veins of Latin America must have confirmed this. Wake up, President Obama! Over the years, Carlos Moore has shown up unannounced in situations where black people were in abundance. Once I remember to my astonishment at a black arts festival in Atlanta, I looked around and there he was. In some other place where I was speaking. The last time was just a month or so ago, before his dishonest petition surfaced. He approached me in Miami, of course, Gusano City, where we were both speaking at Florida International University. As soon as we met, he pulled out his dirt and asked me to sign it. In the act of refusing, I asked him, how could he be everywhere all the time and for so long pushing the same garbage? I said, some comrades are suspicious where your sustenance comes from. And then he's making these charges from where? Brazil. Where racism and poverty are open and intense. Why don't he attack them? He got belligerent then, telling me I had no right to talk to him like that. And as it turned out, the petition was nothing but a fraud cooked up by what is called the American Interest Section in Cuba, a pseudonym for U.S. anti-Cuban activities. It turned out that the so-called black Cuban patriot, Darcy Ferrer, raised in Moore's dishonest position, is not a patriot at all, but an anti-Cuban Negro rascal who is working hand in pocket with the American Interest Section to violate the Cuban Socialist national health care system by running a private clinic with United States sponsorship and in violation of Cuban law. Here we are here trying to vote on a weak facsimile of a public health care system, and we are supposed to denounce the revolutionary Cuban government who already has such a system and who always stood in support of the Afro-American struggle for equal rights and self-determination in defense of some Gusano in blackface who is actually fighting against we ourselves need. Another coincidence? Don't bet on it. And then there's a little addition that Sam put in here, who is Carlos Moore? For more information, visit afrocubaweb.com, carlosmoore.htm. Carlos Moore's Afro-Cuban Alliance, la Asociación La Encuentro de la Cultura Cubana, and the Independent Libraries for Cuba have been recipients of NED funds. NED was originally established to channel what previously had been CIA funds. The problem was that their source kept being leaked to the press, so Congress decided to do the funding more overtly. Carlos Moore's relationship to U.S. officialdom has long been the subject of speculation. His piece, Castro, the Blacks in Africa, is alleged to have been published by the CIA with CIA funds. A document circling in the 80s showed his fellowship funding for this period in Southern California in the early 80s. It was from questionable sources, including USAID, a frequent cover for CIA. NED was founded in 1983 precisely because of these types of situations where the funding for propaganda activity was all too easily traceable back to the CIA. Carlos was in fact a translator for Angola's Holden Roberto, whose FNLA was funded by the CIA. And during Roberto's exile in the U.S., Moore spent a lot of time with Roberto as he traveled back and forth between Washington and Miami, an indication of the circles he was moving in. So you should take all that into consideration.
Good evening, sisters and brothers. Good evening. My name is Ashaki Benta, and I'm a member of the Black Left Unity Network and the co-convener of our newly formed Cuban Working Group. This year, members of the Black Left Unity Network took initiative to form the Cuban Working Group as an act both in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution and as a direct challenge to the unconscionable attacks from the forces of U.S. and Western-led imperialism on the revolutionary state of Cuba under the guise of charges of racism. We saw the need for an active and ongoing response to refute these unjustified charges of racism, especially in the African American and progressive communities, and to challenge the involvement of prominent African Americans in these infamous charges. It has been more than 230 years since the American bourgeois revolution for independence from Britain. The American Declaration of Independence fervently stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet, in the richest nation in the world, with access to incalculable wealth and resources, racism has not been eliminated. Neither has poverty. Neither has injustice and exploitation. Neither have violations of workers' rights. Neither has gender discrimination, discrimination against sexual orientation, oppression of nationalities inside the United States, and other forms of oppression. Yet in just 50 years, the Cuban Revolution that has been under enormous economic and political pressure by ongoing efforts to undermine and destroy the social, economic, and political achievements of their revolution, these signers and accusers of racism in Cuba expect the remnants of slavery and racism to be completely eradicated in a small and impoverished nation. As Afro-Cuban economist and political scientist Dr. Esteban Morales has stated, it is true that much remains to be done in Cuba before social inequality disappears once and for all as a problem still hovering over white and black people alike. The latter are more affected mainly as a result of the uneven historical backgrounds that the various races compromising today's Cuban society had in 1959. It would be foolish and all but anti-scientific, he said, to believe that 450 years of colonialism and neo-colonial exploitation can be erased in almost 50 years of revolution, radical though this process may have been. We fervently oppose these unjustified attacks against Cuba and see the charge of racism for what it is. Another version of the historic process of U.S. and Western-led imperialist forces to circumvent and destroy a revolutionary process continually unfolding in an era still dominated by reaction around the world. These same efforts were made to undermine the revolutionary processes in countries such as Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, Nicaragua, just to name a few in the last century. Precious economic and political resources were diverted to respond to the supposedly internal, but actually imperialist-led external attacks to destroy their revolutions on the ground. And they were destroyed. Today, comrades, none of these societies, under the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and the IMF, have been able to maintain the basis for social, economic, and political equality that exists today in Cuba under its programs of health care, education, jobs, housing, social security, freedom of culture, and the other gains and efforts the revolution is making. Let's not let the imperialists open that door again in Cuba, as they have done in other revolutionary movements by erroneously buying into these charges. Opening the door by supporting these unjustified charges will not help to eliminate racism in Cuba, but instead will bring the unbridled market economy upon the Cuban people, where the breeding ground for racism, sexism, increased poverty, illness, disparity, violence, and mobster organized crime like we see in the former Soviet Union, and all other benefits of democracy will be imposed on the Cuban people. In fact, and I'll just end, Cuba's policies of internationalism have arguably been the most politically advanced in the world. And the direct military aid military intervention to help defeat apartheid in Southern Africa in 1988, Cuito Cuanavalle, to direct medical aid and solidarity with Haiti before the earthquake. Since the earthquake, the Western media has been suspiciously silent on the exceptional role Cuba has played in support of Haiti, with reportedly more than 900 healthcare providers on the ground, the largest and most organized contingent they've had on the island. Lastly, many African Americans may not know about some of the unique features of Cuban history, even though African Americans and Cubans have had a deeply rooted history of solidarity with each other. For example, and this is important, during Cuba's first war for independence from Spain in 1868, plantation and slave owner Carlos Cespedes freed and armed the slaves on his plantation and called on them to join the struggle for Cuba's independence. The Afro-Cuban general Antonio Maceo emerged as one of Cuba's most renowned revolutionary leaders of all time. As a result of this struggle, slavery was abolished in Cuba by 1886. What a contrast to U.S. history, where the maintenance of slavery was a precondition for unity between the colonies in the American fight for independence from Britain. Although more than 5,000 blacks fought in the American Revolution, legalized slavery continued for nearly another 100 years. And the U.S. has historically played a role, and the sisters referred to this, in maintaining racism in Cuba. The U.S. intervention and occupation of Cuba starting in 1898, during Cuba's second war for independence, which began in 1895 and where more than half the fighters were black, re-established institutional racism in Cuba. Under the intermittent U.S. occupations there, Afro-Cubans and women, as well as the poor, were barred from voting, holding elected office, owning businesses, land, and etc. Does that sound familiar? Most Cuban historians and scholars agree that the Cuban Socialist Revolution in 1959 abolished legalized institutional racism in Cuba. They have laws in their revolutionary constitution, as the sisters have mentioned. And the conditions of all of the Cuban people have improved under the revolution. In closing, racism, institutionalized or otherwise, has not been abolished any place in the world. Yet Cuba, in our view, remains a hopeful beacon in the Western Hemisphere that humane societies can be constructed that provide the basis for the elimination of all forms of discrimination, exploitation, and oppression.
Amiri Baraka has to leave. They have to go to New Jersey. It's a long trip. So we thank him. Can we just give him a round of applause? And so our final speaker is Glenn Ford, the executive editor of the Black Agenda Report.
Good evening. The signatories to that horrific letter claim that they have a right and an obligation to confront. Those people who signed that letter claim that they have a right and an obligation to confront racism anywhere in the world. And of course they do, and of course all of us do. But they are black political activists, and they also have an obligation to explain why Cuba of all places in this hemisphere and the world, and for what purpose are they criticizing, singling out Cuba, and who benefits from that process. I maintain, and I'm sure all of you all do too, that these signatories have allowed themselves to become tools of the United States government's 50-year criminal policy towards Cuba. Now, some of them may have acted that way unthinkingly, and some of them may be too damn stupid to know what they did, but some of them are quite aware that they were actively collaborating with a U.S. plan for regime change in Cuba. They knew exactly what they were doing. And we know that they were conscious collaborators in U.S. foreign policy because of what at least one of them wrote since signing that letter. His name is Dr. Ron Walters. He's a political science professor at the University of Maryland, whom I have considered to be a friend for the last 35 years. But he has made himself an enemy of the Cuban people and the Cuban state, and therefore he can no longer be a friend of mine. There are a lot of people on that list who can no longer be friends of mine, or of yours. I'm going to go through Dr. Walters' article shortly, but first let's spend a couple of seconds with Carlos Moore. We understand that Carlos Moore's profession is bashing Cuba. We understand that in causing this letter to be written, he scored a huge coup for his client, his main client these days, the United States government. Dr. Moore will of course be paid for his services to the U.S. government. We actually know how he expects to be paid because he told us how he expects to get paid in his own writing in an article that he published in the U.S. media in April of last year. And we'll examine that extraordinary document in just a little bit. Then there is, of course, Dr. Darcy Ferrer. They call him a political prisoner. He's supposed to be a civil rights leader in Cuba. We know that he's a civil rights leader in Cuba because the right-wing exiles in Miami say he's a civil rights leader. And so does the U.S. government say that he is a civil rights leader. And we all know that the exiles in Miami and the U.S. government are the authorities on all things that are civil rights. They have respect for civil rights. For the past 10 years or so, in fact, they have been sending money and equipment of all kinds to all kinds of people in Cuba in the name of civil rights, including Dr. Darcy Ferrer and his friends. And if you have any doubt that Dr. Ferrer and his friends are genuine civil rights workers, just ask the Wall Street Journal. They gave Dr. Ferrer a big write-up in their paper. And everybody knows the Wall Street Journal is a big friend of civil rights. I've been an activist in civil rights and in human rights for all my life, but the U.S. government has never sent me a check, never sent me a cell phone. And I've come to the conclusion that I'm in the wrong country. What I need to do is pick up and take my civil rights sign and move to a country that the United States wants to overthrow. Then all I'll have to do is just sit there and wait for my instructions and my check. And then I'll get a call from the Wall Street Journal too. Dr. Ferrer is charged with unauthorized use of construction materials on his house. He says that he spends his spare time when he's not doing civil rights work taking care of the health needs of the black poor. I thought that health care was free in Cuba. And I thought that it was very good care. And it must be good care because people in Cuba live slightly longer than people in the United States. And I also know that blacks and mixed race people in Cuba live only 1 year less than white people in Cuba. In the United States, blacks die 6 years earlier than white people. Black Cubans live 5 years longer than African Americans. So maybe Dr. Ferrer needs to come up here and give us some of his health care and get a side order of civil rights. Now back to Ron Walters, my used-to-be friend. He wrote a very long explanation for putting his signature on that dastardly letter. He said very bluntly that he wants the Obama administration to put pressure on Cuba to change what he calls its racist policies. And then he delivers the line, the couple of sentences that makes his agenda and Dr. Carlos Moore's agenda and the U.S. government's agenda perfectly clear. Listen to this carefully. This is what Dr. Walters writes, and I'm quoting him directly. Given that the human rights policies of China and other countries have been questioned by the United Nations, the U.S., and human rights groups, so such questions should become part of any negotiations on the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Cuba, unquote. Dr. Walters is an esteemed political scientist. He chooses his words very carefully. He means what he says. And what that statement means is that the U.S. should demand to negotiate with Cuba over the status of Cuba's black citizens. And if the U.S. is not satisfied with its negotiations with Cuba over Cuba's black citizens, then the United States should not normalize relations with Cuba. It should continue the illegal blockade. That is the substance of Dr. Ron Walters' statement. Dr. Walters agrees that the U.S. should dictate Cuba's internal affairs, that the United States, of all nations in the world, should act as an agent for black people's interests in Cuba. Now, whether the other signatories to that letter agree with that or not, they should understand that that's the import of it. So let's take that kind of logic to its conclusion. If the U.S. can negotiate for Cuba's blacks, then Cuba should be empowered to negotiate for us. And I think that would be a better deal. Because we already know that Cuban blacks live longer than America's blacks. Cuba could demand freedom for all black political prisoners. It could demand an end to black mass incarceration. It could demand programs to put blacks back to work. It could demand a lot of things. But I don't think that that's what Dr. Ron Walters had in mind. I don't think that's what Carlos Moore had in mind. What does Carlos Moore really want out of this deal that he wants to strike with the devil? A deal that would allow the United States to be the arbiter of how black people are treated in Cuba. He spells that out just like Ron Walters does. These people put their stuff in the street. He spells it out very clearly in an article that he wrote for the McClatchy newspaper chain for April 21st of last year. The title of the article is quite telling. The title is, "Who Will Obama Help to Empower in Cuba?" Not why is the U.S. seeking regime change in Cuba, but who can profit from that regime change in Cuba. He doesn't want to know whether the U.S. has a right to interfere in Cuba, but what regime change will look like and what's in it for him. This is his article, and I've outlined in red the pertinent places. Moore warns that there's going to be racial trouble in Cuba. He says, it is in the interest of the U.S., the Caribbean, and the larger region to envision and construct countermeasures to respond to the very real possibility of future turmoil in Cuba. He wants to create the turmoil and then respond to it. He advocates that the U.S. take actions to overthrow the Cuban state, but he is careful to ask for his piece of the action. He says, the chief failure of U.S. policy is that the U.S. has consistently refused to engage black civil society inside of Cuba by espousing its struggle for civil rights and power sharing. He says the U.S. has attempted to build an island constituency by acting solely through surrogate human rights groups that refuse to address racial oppression in Cuba. What he's looking for is a contract in regime change. He says that Radio Marti and TV Marti represent an opopportunity. He says that their failure to achieve, talking about Radio Marti and TV Marti, their failure to achieve the desired impact is largely attributable to broadcasting content crafted by white Cuban Americans with low or no sensibility for Cuba's current demographic reality. That is, he is saying that what we need is more blacks on TV Marti and other propaganda outfits. This is his contribution. He wants to improve and bring diversity to the U.S. destabilization program. He says the almost total absence of Afro-Cubans in conceptualizing, crafting the content for, or implementing these U.S. programs designed to bring democracy to Cuba guarantees they will have virtually no impact. But call Dr. Carlos Moore and I will give you, for a consultant fee, all the diversity and impact that you want. Carlos Moore offers his own expertise to the Americans. He says, an understanding of the true nature of Cuban society, its internal tensions and long-standing socio-racial cleavages will ensure that the U.S., this is important, will ensure that the U.S. crafts policies toward Cuba that will serve the best interests of the U.S. and also will empower Cuban society. The best interests of the U.S. This is what he's offering. And he's not doing it under the table. He's doing it in a newspaper chain in the United States. He wants the U.S. He wants the U.S. to make more demands on Cuba. He says the U.S. must also incorporate specific U.S. demands, whereby the Castro regime is made to understand that it too must lift the internal political and racial embargo, whatever the hell that is, imposed on the majority population. That is also Ron Walter's demand, that the U.S. negotiate for Cuban blacks through people like himself. Then Carlos Moore calls for the creation of a U.S.-based African-American Afro-Cuban Foundation, those big pockets you put money in. He says the tens of millions of taxpayer dollars now spent on programs to foster democracy in Cuba have proven ineffective and could usefully be channeled into such an African-American Afro-Cuban Foundation. I can let you guess who would be paid by that foundation. And finally, Carlos Moore says the U.S. should pressure Havana to allow creation and legal incorporation of a national Afro-Cuban Foundation for social and economic development directed and controlled exclusively by Cubans of African descent with no regime affiliation, or continue the embargo. What he is now asking for, he's escalated his demand, is he wants to get a paid job in Havana. That's what all of this nonsense is about.